And so how do we defend our fact-based journalism, news reporting, differentiate ourselves from opinion journalism, and defend the work that we do?
Yeah, that's really, really important. Thanks for focusing on that, and thanks, Joy, for all the great points on that. I think
Yes.
Joy had some really great specific suggestions about how to do that, and to do that more often, and to do it, in various ways, and there's various ways to make it natural within news coverage. I think we need more of it. What my research focuses on is actually really carefully studying the effects of doing things like that on the audience. And what we found very, very strongly is that even a little bit goes a long way. So, you do a little bit of defending journalism, a little bit of, media literacy, together with a little bit more fact checking. And what you get is an increase in media trust, an increase in intention to use mainstream news, and also an increase in confidence that it's possible to figure out what the truth is. And these are really encouraging results. And it's actually, that might sound kind of like obvious outcomes, but every one of those is a difficult thing to influence in a short study like we typically do. We did about a 5-day study where we experimentally assigned people to a pretty small number of, in this case, it was op-eds. But I think, definitely, I think listening to Joy is probably better than listening to me about practically how to operationalize this. I think, just the point is that a very little bit of it, we gave them within a newsfeed that had about 1,200 stories. We gave them 12 op-eds defending journalism. And we gave them about twice that many fact checks, about 23, I think, fact checks over the course of 5 days. And our news users were, they were free to choose what stories they wanted. Most of them didn't click on any of those stories defending journalism, but the mere presence of those stories did have those benefits. And so what this really points to is that there's been really a one-sided conversation about the trustworthiness of news. And I'm not just talking about recently, I'm talking about, for the last 4 decades, there's been a one-sided conversation. And we know from persuasion research that when you have a one-sided flow of arguments, where, you're only hearing one side, you're only hearing people saying that the media is biased, and you're not hearing a counter argument to that, eventually, even if you don't really trust the people saying that the media is biased, eventually you kind of think that the other side must be conceding the point, right? You don't assume that because the other side is silent, that must be evidence that they're so principled and humble and neutral and wonderful that they're not even going to defend themselves. Instead, you think they're conceding the point. And so that's really, the experiment that journalism has run over the past 4 decades is one that any persuasion researcher could have told you what would be the result, which is, when we just don't respond to any of this building criticism, this increasingly extreme anti-media rhetoric, that people think we're conceding the point. And so that was the motivation for our research. And really, I do want to acknowledge, because I know there definitely are a lot of people out there, maybe not in this particular audience, but you might probably know journalists who have this traditional perspective that we never should respond to criticism, that we shouldn't make ourselves a story ever. I'm sure you guys know people like that. I actually respect that viewpoint. I admire the principled and humble stance there. But I just want to make 2 points for those people, or that you could maybe make when you're talking to those people. One, that you can still be humble and defend your profession, right? Defending your profession is not the same as defending yourself, right? You're not like bragging about yourself. When you defend journalism, you're defending democracy, right? This is something worth defending. This is something really important. This is a principled stand that you don't have to feel like you're bragging to talk about the important public service that your profession provides. And so that's what we focus on in our research, is not defending individual content, which I think is also important, but our research was focused on defending the profession in general. And that's one point. So I think it's okay to defend the profession, and that should get over if you're worried about, it being like making yourself the story. It's not yourself, it's your profession. The second point is that people often claim that the best way to restore trust is to just shut up and do good work. I'm sure you've heard that argument, right? That we should just, just ignore the critics and just, the best way to prove them wrong is just to be really good and just do really careful, objective, good journalism, right? That's the experiment we've done for 4 decades, and media trust has been in continual decline, right? The just ignoring the critics has not worked. And I say that not just as an observation of the decline in media trust, but there's been some very careful research that has looked at the moments looked at the time series of how media trust is changing over time, right? It's not just steadily going down. There's times when it goes up and down. And also how much anti-media rhetoric there is. It's not constant. It's been building and becoming more extreme, but it's the other times when it goes up and down, right? And then also at the same time, a third data source they put together is the amount of partisan valence content in the news. So is it that people think there's partisan bias because they're looking at the news content and seeing partisan valence in the content? And actually, no, the answer is no. The moments when there's a little bit more favorable coverage of Democrats are not the moments when people think there's a liberal bias. It's when people are accusing the news of liberal bias and journalists are not responding. Those are the moments when we see this change over time, this build in perceptions of media bias and decreasing trust. So that's some very good research looking over time. Complementing that, there's also been experimental research, some past research that I can share links if anybody's interested in. I'll share the link to my research, and it has the sites of these things. So I'll just share that in a minute in the chat. So there's both observational research that sees that in general we have really, it's not what journalists are doing so much that's decreasing trust. It's what people are saying about journalism. And by being silent about journalism, people are basically thinking journalists are conceding the point. So that I don't want to get too much into details. I can answer follow-up questions, but I just want to close on one point that I really am worried right now that journalists are dropping the ball on defending journalism. I really am. I think we saw a really encouraging sign that this was something they were finally waking up to needing to do when the anti-media rhetoric got so extreme. When mainstream organizations were being called fake news and the enemies of the people, we saw a very concerted effort to counter that because it was novel and extreme, and it was really alarming. And so we saw a surge in both in willingness to defend journalism and also in media trust. We actually did see an increase in media trust. I think we now that same rhetoric, it's just as extreme as it was, but it's not novel anymore. And so we're not talking about it as much anymore. And so I think I'm so glad you guys are organizing this now. And I think, journalists really need to be finding more ways to bring this up. I mean, if you can't write the same op-ed every day, I understand, right? I mean, but it doesn't need to always be an op-ed. It doesn't need to, it doesn't need to be all that frequent, but find ways to get that media literacy message out there about what journalists do. And I would say, I would go even one step further. Don't just counter the most extreme anti-journalism rhetoric. We need to counter the idea that journalists are somehow the same thing as partisan hacks. That's something that people really believe. And I think Joy touched on this, that people really do, they don't see the difference between what a journalist does and what people are doing in partisan media. And so I think it's important for journalists to counter just a basic criticism that the media is somehow intentionally creating liberally biased news. That's something that needs to be pushed back on. Even it might seem like the most familiar and mild form of criticism, but I think if we can draw a distinction between the idea that we might sometimes accidentally have a liberal bias versus intentionally writing stories that support one side, that I think is a really important point for media literacy. People do want there to be a judge not a judge, but an umpire, right? Calling the balls and strikes in facts. People want that, and they don't believe that journalists are doing that as much as journalists really are. And so I think journalists are the ones who need to speak up because they're the only ones who can speak authoritatively about their own intentions. right? They're the only ones who can speak authoritatively about their own practices in the newsroom to avoid bias. And so we really need to hear that side. We can't just have this imbalanced flow of constant drumbeat of criticism of the media, without hearing the other side, because then they'll just think that people will just think that journalists are conceding that point.